Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludtke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludtke, and today on the Further Light Podcast, I want to explore the Morgan Affair. Now, some of you may be very familiar with the ideas with what's going to happen with the Morgan Affair, some of you less so, but what I want to do is something a little different. What I want to do is take the information that's out there on the Morgan Affair, the reputable information, or what I consider to be reputable information, I want to break it down. So this series is going to be a little different. And I did say series. We're going to be looking at 6 separate episodes. One, today, the introduction, an overview, trying to familiarize you with the basic concepts, the basic narrative of the Morgan Affair. But then what I want to do is take the dry history and make it into a relatable narrative. In doing so, I want to explore 4 characters during this 6-part series. So we're going to be looking in part 2 at William Morgan, part 3 at David Miller, the printer. Part 4, we're going to look at Samuel Green, who's a member of the Lodge. He says he's giving an unbiased opinion, but there are some issues with that. We'll get into that. And Part 5, we'll be looking at the Mason. And finally, Part 6, we'll start looking at what may have happened to Morgan. Where did he go? In each of these parts, those character studies on Morgan, Miller, Green, and the Masons at the time, what we're going to do is look at things right up to the point of the disappearance. With the Masons, we're going to look a little bit beyond the disappearance. And I'm going to try and base most of the information on things that we have reputable sources for. Now, obviously, the Anti-Masonic Party and all of that is an issue in this period, but we're going to deal with that in another series down the line. And when I talk about sources, I want to get into really some of these more solid sources. So I'm going to give you a bit of a bibliography here. I'm looking at Wayne Anderson, the Morgan Affair or William Morgan Mystery from Skirit.com. I'm looking at a fantastic book by Stephen Defoe, Morgan, the Scandal That Shook Freemasonry, published in 2009 by Cornerstone Book Publishers. It is probably the best single study on the Morgan Affair that you will ever read. It is also nearly impossible to get your hands on, so I want to personally thank worshipful brother Pat Choka for loaning me his copy of the book. I also look at John Dickey, The Craft, great history of Masonry, highly recommended. There's also the New York State Report that's put out in 1831. There's an article by Mark Tabert, Breast the Storm, printed in the Annals of Quattro Coronati, volume 125 in 2012. There's also Ben Williams, All You Need to Know About the Infamous Morgan Affair on RockyMountainMason.com. There are several other sources I will be getting into as well. And today my whole goal is to introduce the characters, the Morgan Affair overall. Otherwise, what I end up doing is we go through each of these characters, these 4 main figures, Morgan, Miller, Green, and the Masons overall, and I would be piecing them together without ever giving you the framework. So that's the goal today. We're looking at growth and development. The reason for breaking the series down this way is so that we can look at motivation, so that we can see that these are humans making decisions based on what they believe is best at the time. And there will be some surprising outcomes that we come across. Arguably, this is one element in the, let's call it, hardcore masonry episodes that I do on occasion on the podcast. I call them that because I really love a podcast called Hardcore History, which gets into really gritty elements of history. So we're looking at an overview so that you can better understand the character studies that we do later. My overall goal for all of this is to breathe some life into what is often a dry history or a really fast history, one that we just breeze right through in 1,000 words or 250 words. Here's the Morgan affair and move on. Some guy died in New York, or he disappeared, or maybe he's in the Bahamas, maybe he's a pirate. We don't know. And so I want to explore that. So let's start talking about the Morgan affair. The Morgan affair, of course, begins with William Morgan. He is thought to be a captain during the War of 1812, an issue we will get into in part 2. After the war, Morgan, who's in his 40s, marries a 19-year-old Lucinda Pendleton in Richmond, Virginia, and they have 2 kids. Now, the age gap is not unusual for the period. The usual idea at this period, so we're around 1812 to 1820, is that at least one member of a couple has to basically set up shop, has to make money sufficient to buy a house and raise children and everything else. Usually it's going to be both parties, but we do have one-party systems, and these are more partnerships. This is more of a business partnership than our classical love-based romance and marriage. There's a whole history there. If you're ever interested, Stephanie Coons writes a great history on marriage that's available out there. But anyway, after the birth of his children, Morgan moves his family to Canada, where he starts a brewery. The brewery will burn down, and this leaves Morgan in poverty. After the fire, he moves his family to Rochester, New York. So now we've gotten into the right state. We're in New York. There, allegedly, and that's a big term here, big important one, he becomes a member of a local Masonic lodge, Wells Lodge number 282. It's important to note that there is no written evidence of Morgan ever being raised in that lodge or, in fact, in any lodge. We don't find any record of degrees for Morgan, or at least no one has. And a side note here, the problem you run into is William Morgan is a really common name. And so we have lots of William Morgans that turn up all over the place. It's really common, especially in eastern Canada and in the Northeast. And so we get a lot of bad information, but there's nothing we can positively link to it. So it's questioned whether Morgan ever actually goes through the 3 degrees of Freemasonry at all. And I should point out that at this time, we're in the early 1820s. At this time, there have already been several books written on Freemasonry that are going into, here are the signs, scripts, and words. Here is the catechism, the posting of Masonry. Here's really everything you would ever need to know to play yourself off as a Mason. And the reason they're doing it at the time is Masons, prior to the Civil War, and we'll get into some of this a little later in this episode, tend to be upper class. They tend to be the kind of people that you want on your side. And so there's a lot of interest in joining this group, even if you wouldn't be generally accepted. Skipping ahead, there is some documentation that he receives the Royal Arch degrees, or York Rite, and joins Western Star chapter of Royal Arch Masons number 33 of Leroy, New York. Leroy is right near Batavia, where most of our story will go down. To receive the degrees, he would have had to have gone through Masonry, through the degrees of Freemasonry, and is believed that Morgan convinced a friend to vouch for him rather than go through the proper process of verifying membership. And this is quite common in the period, because if you go through, let's say he went through his degrees in Canada, the only way that anyone would be able to verify that would be a letter, but a lot of people lose these letters. And so there's a whole system of vouching for people, and we still see that in use today, where if you don't bring your dues card, someone could potentially vouch for you if they know you to be a Mason. So after receiving these degrees in about 1825, Morgan became well known in Freemasonry in the area. He gave speeches about the craft, helped with degree work, and helped with several Royal Arch chapters, one of them being in Batavia. By the time he arrives there, questions are growing about whether or not he's truly a Mason. There's one man by the name of Ganson who is behind a lot of these questions. Again, something we'll get into in a later episode. Because of this, his name was left off documents for chartering a new Royal Arch Lodge showing him as a founding member. On top of this, members of the local Batavia Lodge, where Morgan lived, denied him admission into the lodge at one point, or may have denied him admission, at least into the new Royal Arch that was forming in the area. So Morgan becomes angry at the fraternity. He feels that they are disrespecting his experience. So he threatens to write a book called Illustrations of Masonry. Now, this is not a new idea. Samuel Pritchard is writing Illustrations of Masonry, this sort of broad look at Masonry, as early as 1730, 100 years earlier. The London Times ran an article in the 1720s which incorporated all of the known degree work at the time of Blue Lodge Masonry. So there's nothing here that's going to be new. There were 3 backers of the book, one being David C. Miller, a local newspaper publisher who had a grudge against the fraternity. He had gone through the first degree of Masonry and was prevented from continuing. His progression was stopped for due cause. We don't know what the cause was, but we know that he was stopped. Records indicate that 1 or more members of Batavia objected to his continuation. A rare thing, but it does happen in Masonry, where someone already going through their degrees will be objected to and removed from the lodge, or effectively removed. Miller and 2 other backers of Morgan's book enter into a bond with Morgan for $500,000. The bond doesn't mean that he's going to make $500,000. It basically means we're going to stand behind you, and bonds are tricky things at the time. Morgan was offered 1/4 of the profits of the book once published. By the way, really good royalties. Today, you might get 5%. Now, it's important to remember, Morgan is about 100 years too late to reveal the ritual of Masonry. As I said, it's already been published. It's been in the major newspapers, it's been in Pritchard, it's been in several other illustrations of Masonry. At the time, there were accusations unknown individuals tried to burn Miller's newspaper down because the local Masons knew of this connection between Morgan and Miller. Several Masons regularly went to Morgan's house, protested, stating that Morgan owed them money. Finally, he will be accused of stealing a shirt and tie, leading to his arrest. He will be acquitted of stealing the tie. Instead, he was locked up in debtor's prison until a debt of just over $2 was repaid. Today, that would be an $80 debt. Very, very minimal, but he didn't have it. It's here that the details of the story become vague and shrouded. So some accounts have a group of unknown men showing up in the prison, paying his debt, and taking him off into the darkness, never to be seen again. Others argue that Miller arrived, his printing compatriot, to pay his debt, and the 2 men disappeared into the night, Morgan to disappear and basically escape life, and then never to be heard of again. One commonality among the stories was that Morgan somehow ends up at Fort Niagara on the Niagara River bordering Canada. Now you're in northern New York. You want to get rid of someone, moving them to Canada seems like a really good idea. What kind of impact does this have? Well, Miller publicized the matter in the Republican Advocate, the paper he runs in Batavia, New York, and claimed that Morgan had been murdered by local Freemasons. Despite a massive search and a huge reward, at one point cited as $2,000, so the equivalent of about $80,000 today. And to do those changes in terms of money, I'm multiplying things by about 40, which is the generally accepted norm when you're dealing with the 1840s, so these may be slightly greater totals. These rewards are offered by DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York and Grand Master of Masons in the state. No evidence is ever produced to substantiate the charge of murder, nor is there a body ever found, although they will find other bodies. Regardless, opposition to Masonry becomes so widespread, so virulent, that the organization is basically decimated in the northeastern United States. Members desert, lodges cease to exist, and in some cases, Grand Lodges cease to meet. It's just becoming too dangerous to be a Mason, to be associated, and so people will distance themselves. And you could imagine that happening today. Something bad happens, everyone goes, no, I'm not that kind of Mason, or I'm not a Mason. But this is a massive reaction to a local issue. At the same time, people look at Masons at the time as this secret society that kind of runs things. And as we're going to see, in this case, they kind of do. So it becomes really tricky. We will see an anti-Masonic party formed, fielding the first national third-party presidential candidate and introducing the process of national nominating conventions to select a nominee. So that whole idea of a Democratic and Republican convention actually comes out of the anti-Masonic party in the 1830s. Established in 1827, the anti-Masonic party found support in religious movements opposed to Freemasonry. It was transformed into a political movement opposed to the presidential incumbent and former Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Tennessee at the time, Andrew Jackson. Also unpopular president at the time, especially after a really nasty presidential election. I think it was 1826 when he runs against John Quincy Adams, and we have allegations of sexual misconduct going back and forth between the two candidates. Yes, in the 1800s, we see exactly the same thing that we see today. And it was supported by anti-Masonic local newspapers, including New York's The Countryman and the New York Register, an anti-Masonic review, Vermont's Middlebury Free Press, Massachusetts, Franklin Freeman. There's anti-Masonic reviews and newspapers all over the country. It's very, very popular at the time. Everyone kind of jumps on that bandwagon. And there were many others. We see various papers written and delivered that will note these ideas. A census at the time counted 52 anti-Masonic newspapers in New York State alone in 1831. Now, I should point out, to say like Waukesha or Milwaukee probably had over between 5 and 10 newspapers that would have been generally regarded as reasonable and acceptable. At the time, you would have different political parties would have their own newspaper. You would have the general newspaper. You would have all these different forms. So it's a big number, 52 anti-Masonic newspapers, but it's not too terribly surprising. The anti-Masonic fervor will last approximately 2 decades. It's only late in the 1840s that it crashes. It declines quickly, actually starting around 1832, as most members will join the new Whig Party, and it disappears about 1840. So, what happens? Because by the mid-1840s, Masonry's on the rise again, going into the Civil War. So what happens? Well, Michael Halloran, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, by the way, I interviewed Halloran on 2 earlier episodes of the podcast, talks about this. And what Masonry does is it moves from a club, a fraternal organization for the elite, for the upper class, and maybe the upper middle class. And it starts changing. And we see this change on a local level. It's not a big, broad change. But we see this shift to accepting the middle class, the lower middle class, and in many cases, the working class into their ranks. And what that does is it opens up opportunity to people where there wouldn't have been a lot of opportunity in the past. And they're going to take that opportunity because in a time when networking is everything, who you know is the most important thing in your life, well, joining an organization is going to be important. As Halloran points out, by the 1850s, late 1850s, just before the Civil War, somewhere between 20 and 40% of all American males belong to a fraternal organization. It could be the Odd Fellows, the Knights of Pythias. There are many of them that compete with Freemasonry. And you want to be a member of one of those. You want the networking opportunities. You want the first chance to get in on business. And so what's going to happen is as we allow people in lower socioeconomic levels to come into the fraternity necessarily grows. And arguably, this is one of those massive landslide shifts that changes the trajectory and the idea of Masonry. We could have died out in the 1830s and 1840s had we stuck to our old principles, had we not changed anything. And so by the time you get to the Civil War, we have an unusually high number of Masons out on the battlefield, but also a huge number of people who are trying to join Masonry before they enlist. A huge number of people who are trying to join after they see the advantages of Masonry on the battlefield. They see those signs given, hear the words spoken, and see the assistance given from the other side. And we get into this in the symposium that we did in January about Masonry and the Civil War, which may or may not be already on the podcast by the time this is published. So what I'm doing here is I've laid the groundwork. We know that Morgan is a Mason. We know, or may be a Mason. He may be an imposter. He is getting to Batavia. He's having a fallout with the lodge. He threatens to publish this book, and it may or may not have gotten him killed. Now we get into the fun. We get into the weeds. In episode 2, I'm going to look at Morgan, and just Morgan. Just his interactions, who he is, and what leads to his disappearance that night in the jail. And in doing so, I'm hoping to really be able to pull out why someone would do this. What are his motives, his ideas? Is he really a bad guy? Is he a guy down on his luck? What's going on? There's something to be said about the madness of crowds, and I think this is one of those situations. I think you're going to find that even the Masons who are actively involved in the disappearance come off as, well, at least reasonable figures for a lot of it. Individually, they're making reasonable decisions. The problem is, when those decisions come to a crowd, they tend to get elevated. And we've seen that. You can look around history and see that. It's why we stoned people in biblical times, and the entire community had to do it, because that way no single individual is really guilty. It's why we have communal punishment in so many ancient societies. Everyone pushes a little bit further until we get to this end point. And even then, people have conscience. But it's only when we can explore the individual figures that we can start parsing that out and really understanding what's happening for the Morgan affair. So history is more interesting when you start to look at all of these perspectives. Next time, we're going to look at the perspective of William Morgan in part 2 of the Morgan affair.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.